Three men in Armani suits were pointing guns at each other when Darcy Holm walked in with a spreadsheet and a cold coffee. She had been told the third-floor conference room was reserved for a supplier meeting. Nobody had mentioned the weapons. Gentlemen. Her voice came out steadier than it had any right to. I'm going to need 5 minutes at the table. Nobody moved. Darcy set down her laptop anyway. The numbers had been wrong by $412,000 for the better part of a year, and in her professional opinion, that particular problem did not care who was pointing a gun at whom. She clicked to the first tab. The discrepancy originates here. She tapped the screen. 13 months of falsified supplier invoices. The payments have been routed through 3 shell accounts, 2 of which are registered to a numbered company in Montserrat. She checked her notes. The beneficial owner of that company is listed as a D. Strauss. That name doesn't appear on any of the Casale Group's employment records, but it does appear on a lease agreement for a property in Laval. She looked up. Signed by the man currently sitting second from the left. The silence that followed had genuine mass. Victor Casale had not spoken since she walked in. He sat at the head of the table, both hands flat on the surface, watching her the way a person watches something they cannot yet classify. 2 associates flanked him on either side. Across the table, 3 men Darcy had never seen before had become very still. One of them was no longer touching the weapon at his hip, because whatever she had just presented had rearranged the room's entire power structure in a way that bullets couldn't fix. Victor looked at the spreadsheet, then at Darcy, then at the man second from the left. Then, for the first time in 7 years, Victor Casale laughed. Nobody breathed. The bodyguard nearest the door looked at his counterpart. His counterpart stared at the floor. The man second from the left had gone the precise grey of old concrete. Darcy stood very still behind her laptop and became aware, slowly, that she had walked into something significantly larger than a billing discrepancy. Victor's laughter faded. What remained in his expression was harder to name. Something between amusement and calculation, and not entirely comfortable to be on the receiving end of. "Who sent you?" he asked. "Finance sent me." She cleared her throat. There was a flag in the quarterly reconciliation. "I've been with the Casale Group for 9 days. 9 days. I'm thorough." He studied her for a long moment. Then he glanced toward his associates. "Take Mr. Strauss somewhere quiet." 2 of the men across the table stood. The third did not go quietly, though he went. Victor returned his attention to Darcy. "You may go, miss." "Holm, Darcy Holm." He said nothing else. Darcy closed her laptop, collected her cold coffee, and walked out. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall for approximately 4 seconds. Then she went back to her desk, because the quarterly numbers were still due by Friday. That was how it started. Victor did not summon her. He did not increase her security clearance, or offer any formal acknowledgement of what had happened. What he did do, and she only noticed it because she noticed everything, was begin routing certain financial documents directly to her inbox rather than through the general accounting department. The documents were complicated. Shell structures nested inside holding companies, nested inside numbered corporations, in jurisdictions that required a map and a law degree to navigate. She untangled them methodically, the way she had once untangled her aunt's tax situation in her first year of practice, which had involved 2 common law spouses, 3 provinces, and a boat registered in her aunt's cat's name. The Casale Group was more organized than her aunt, marginally. Darcy Holm was 28 years old and had graduated top of her cohort from Concordia's John Molson School of Business. She had taken the Casale contract because the pay was exceptional and because her previous employer had dissolved in a very public fraud investigation that was, for the record, entirely someone else's fault. She had not known precisely what the Casale Group's other business interests were. She had suspected, she had chosen, professionally, not to pursue that particular line of inquiry. What she had not anticipated was becoming interesting to Victor Casale. It happened in small steps. 3 days after the conference room, she arrived at work to find a fresh coffee on her desk, black, from the espresso machine in the executive kitchen that accounting staff did not technically have access to. No note. The next morning, same thing. On the 4th morning, she brought her own thermos, because she was not the kind of person who grew comfortable with unexplained gifts, and found Victor standing near the kitchen doorway when she passed. He said nothing. She said nothing. She went to her desk. That afternoon, a financial report she had been waiting 3 weeks for appeared in her inbox, signed off and expedited. She told herself it was coincidence. She was very smart, and therefore knew that it wasn't. The interactions stayed small. They stayed professional. But they accumulated, the way snow accumulates, quietly, and then suddenly it was impossible to walk without noticing. Victor began appearing in the accounting suite once a week, ostensibly to review reports with the department head. Darcy sat in the far corner by the window and did not look up from her monitors. She was aware, in the way she was always aware of structural things in a room, that his path to the department head's office did not require him to pass her desk. He passed it anyway. "The Ile-de-Serres property," he said one Tuesday, pausing beside her without preamble. "You flagged it last week." "The carrying costs don't match the reported use," she said, without looking up. "Either it's generating undisclosed revenue, or someone is running personal expenses through it. Possibly both." Silence. "Neither option improves the quarterly picture," she added. "No," he agreed, and then something she hadn't expected. "You're right." She looked up then. Victor Casale was 42 years old, and in photographs, which was the only way most people encountered him, he looked exactly as powerful and remote as his reputation required. In person, he was harder to categorize. There was something watchful behind the stillness. Something that wasn't coldness so much as an old wound that had healed at the wrong angle. He held her gaze for a moment, then continued to the department head's office. Darcy looked back at her screen. Her cursor blinked at her. She went back to work. She learned the shape of him gradually, the way you learn the layout of a building you spend real time in. Not all at once, but until the whole structure becomes familiar without you realizing it's happened. Victor was precise. He remembered numbers the way other people remembered faces. He did not raise his voice, which everyone around him seemed to find more frightening than if he had. His staff did not joke in his presence. They straightened their posture and shortened their sentences and waited for him to leave before exhaling. Darcy was, constitutionally, incapable of shortening her sentences when something needed explaining. The first time she interrupted him, in a budget review, to correct a figure his CFO had misread aloud, the room did what rooms did around Victor. It froze. Victor looked at her. "You're certain?" "The original is on page 14. She slid her copy across the table. "Second column, 3rd row. The CFO read from the projection summary, which hasn't been updated since August. Victor checked the page. Then he looked at the CFO. Then he said, "Continue," and the meeting went on. Afterward, in the corridor, one of the senior associates touched her elbow. "That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've watched in this building." Darcy retrieved her elbow politely. The number was wrong. Decisions would have been made on incorrect information. "Yes, but..." He stopped. "He didn't correct you." "I know." "He never..." Another stop. "He doesn't let people." "I noticed," she said, and went back to her desk. She heard about Lev Casale from Marth. Marth had been the Casale family's housekeeper for 31 years. She was 73, had a voice like gravel in a tin can, and possessed a total and absolute immunity to Victor's silences that Darcy found both impressive and quietly reassuring. She found Darcy in the building's small employee kitchen one evening, when Darcy had stayed late to finish a reconciliation and was eating a container of leftover pasta from home. Marth sat down across from her without being invited and poured herself tea from Darcy's thermos as though it were hers. "You're the one who made him laugh," she said. "I walked into the wrong meeting." "You walked into exactly the right one." Marth wrapped both hands around the cup. He used to laugh constantly when he was young, before. Something in her tone made Darcy stay quiet. Marth looked toward the window. Rain pressed against the glass in long, thin lines. "His brother, Lev." She said the name carefully, the way you say something that still has edges. "He was 31, Victor's opposite in every way, loud, warm, the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday and brought back pastries without being asked." A pause. 7 years ago, there was a confrontation, not meant for Lev. Lev was not involved in any of it. He was simply there. Darcy did not ask what happened next. She could tell from how Marth held the cup. Victor reached the hospital 20 minutes too late. Marth set down the thermos lid. He has not stopped working since. He made the company larger, safer, more protected. He made sure everyone in his orbit was provided for. She looked at Darcy steadily. But providing for people and being present with them are not the same thing. Darcy thought about Victor, eating alone at the corner table she had glimpsed through a doorway, about the way every person in his building moved around him like water around stone, necessary, adaptive, never quite touching. "He blames himself," Darcy said. "Yes," Martha stood. "That is why I was glad to hear him laugh, even once." She picked up her cup. He didn't start coming back to himself because someone fixed something for him. He started because someone didn't bother being afraid of him. She looked at Darcy with the directness of someone who had long since run out of patience for anything indirect. "Don't stop." She left. Darcy sat with her pasta and the rain and a thought she couldn't quite finish. The atmosphere changed on a Wednesday. She felt it before she understood it, a slight recalibration in how the office arranged itself around her. Colleagues who had been friendly became careful. A junior analyst who had shared her lunch table for 2 weeks suddenly found somewhere else to be. Approvals she needed moved slower than they had. It took her 3 days to trace it to Gregor Bast. Gregor was Victor's chief of operations, efficient, watchful, and precisely the kind of person who treated loyalty as arithmetic. He had been observing the shift in Victor's attention and had arrived incorrectly at a conclusion. He had not confronted Darcy directly. He had simply circulated the implication that she was clever, that she was ambitious, and that cleverness combined with ambition in someone who had Victor's attention was a variable the organization should be cautious about. It was not a threat. It was worse than a threat. It was a weather pattern. Darcy absorbed it. She did not go to Victor. She did not confront Gregor. She worked. She answered her emails. She stayed late on a Thursday to help a junior accountant debug a pivot table because the work needed doing and the kid looked exhausted. When the analyst who had abandoned her lunch table apologized, awkward and insufficient, she shrugged and offered him half her sandwich because she'd made too much and it seemed like the obvious thing to do. She was not performing grace. She simply could not see the point of doing otherwise. Victor noticed the withdrawal before she had fully named it herself. He appeared at her desk on a Friday morning. She was on a call. She held up one finger without looking at him, a reflex she regretted the moment she did it. Finished the call and looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning. A beat. Something is different. I've rearranged my monitor." "That's not what I mean." 3 people nearby had stopped pretending to work. Darcy held his gaze. She thought about Martha's voice, about Lev, about the way grief given long enough starts to look like architecture, load-bearing and invisible and entirely holding up the rest of the structure. "I'm fine," she said, truly. Victor studied her. His jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was processing something he hadn't decided about. Then he looked at the 3 people who had stopped pretending. They immediately started pretending harder. He looked back at Darcy, said nothing, and walked away. 2 days later, at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning, Victor Casale walked into the employee kitchen. No one had ever seen Victor Casale in the employee kitchen. His meals were delivered. His coffee came from a separate machine. His world and the employee kitchen occupied the same building the way parallel lines occupy the same plane, present but non-intersecting. Darcy was refilling her thermos. Every other person in the kitchen became completely motionless. Victor pulled out a chair, the chair across from the only empty mug on the counter. He sat down. The room held its collective breath. Darcy poured her coffee, then, without particular ceremony, poured a second cup and set it in front of him. "You're going to terrify everyone before they've had breakfast," she said. "They'll recover." He wrapped his hand around the mug. "So will you." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them explained what that meant. Neither needed to. Gregor Bast passed the kitchen doorway 12 minutes later and stopped walking entirely. Darcy did not smile. Victor did not look at Gregor. He drank his coffee and asked her a question about the Ile de Seurs carrying costs, and she answered it, and the kitchen slowly remembered how to make noise around them. The weeks that followed were the quietest version of something large. Victor did not change overnight. He was still precise and contained, and still the kind of person whose quietest voice ended arguments. But small things shifted. He stayed in rooms longer after the work was done. He asked questions that weren't strictly operational. He remained in the building's common area one evening when 2 of the kitchen staff were loudly debating the Canadiens' playoff chances, and instead of leaving, he listened. And when one of them made a point that was factually wrong about the power play statistics, he said so, calmly, and was right. Darcy had watched from across the room. She had not smiled. She had failed not to smile. Martha had stopped her in the corridor the next morning and said nothing, just patted her hand once, which somehow covered everything. Darcy's life did not simplify on account of any of this. She had student loans. She had a lease in NDG that required a 3rd roommate who was unreliable with the rent. She had a mother in Sudbury who called every Sunday and asked how the new job was going in a tone that strongly implied she suspected it involved something inadvisable, which was not entirely inaccurate. Some nights, Darcy sat at her kitchen table and ran her own numbers, debt versus savings versus timeline, and felt the distance between where she was and where she intended to be with a clarity that was not comfortable. Victor asked once why she stayed late on Thursdays. "Personal accounting," she said. He didn't push. She appreciated that more than she could have predicted. Drake Osthoff had no particular quarrel with Darcy Holm. What he had was a quarrel with Victor Casale over a commercial waterfront development. Victor had declined to co-sign, and a working theory, cultivated over several months of observation, that Victor's recent restraint during negotiations indicated a softening worth exploiting. He was wrong about the source of the restraint. He was also badly wrong about what it meant. His method of applying pressure was financial. He hired a man, temporary, untraceable, introduced through a third party, to access the Casale Group's internal records during a catered building event and remove documentation connected to the waterfront transaction. Darcy had stayed late that evening because the catering invoice did not match the original quote by $1,100. and she wanted it resolved before month end. She was crossing the second-floor corridor when she noticed a man she didn't recognize standing beside a locked filing room with a document bag that was too full to have arrived that way. "You look lost," she said. He turned. He was not lost. Darcy's read of a room had always been fast. The bag, the filing room, the fact that he'd gone still instead of explaining himself. She stepped back. He stepped forward. She threw her thermos. It was full. It was stainless steel, and it connected with his shoulder hard enough to make him swear and stumble. And in that half-second, she moved, not toward the stairwell, toward the security panel she had memorized on her first day of work, because she had a habit of memorizing exit options in buildings she didn't fully know. He caught her sleeve near the panel. Fabric tore. She drove her elbow into his jaw, hit the panel with her palm, and the alarm went through the building like a physical thing. Security arrived in under 40 seconds. Victor arrived 12 seconds after that, which was faster than his office was to the panel, and suggested he had been moving before the alarm fully sounded. He came around the corner and saw the man restrained against the wall, and Darcy standing beside the panel, with a torn sleeve and a red mark already forming along her forearm. Something in Victor's face went absolutely still. "Who did that?" he said, not a question. Darcy stepped forward before he could move toward the restrained man. "Victor!" He stopped, looked at her. The stillness cracked at the edges. "Are you hurt?" "My arm," she held it up. "I'm not dying, I'm annoyed." One of the security team looked very carefully at the ceiling. Victor crossed the corridor. He looked at her arm. He looked at her face. He was close enough that she could see the exact moment the violence in him decided to go somewhere quieter. "You hit him," he said. "I threw my thermos first and then I hit him, yes." "With what?" "My elbow. I took a self-defense course in 2019. Most of it came back." Victor exhaled. It was a controlled sound, but it had feeling underneath it. "You could have been seriously hurt." "I wasn't." "Darcy." "I set off the alarm, you came. The man is in handcuffs." She met his eyes steadily. Both things happened. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to his security chief. "Call the police. Document everything. I want to know who authorized his access." He paused. "Handle it properly." The restrained man looked surprised. He had expected, apparently, a different kind of response from Victor Casale. Victor looked back at Darcy. "You're getting that arm looked at. It's a bruise. By a doctor. If they prescribe anything alarming, I'm getting a second opinion." Something moved through his expression so quickly she almost missed it. "I'll arrange transport." The doctor confirmed bruising and no fractures. Darcy found Victor on the building's rooftop terrace afterward. The city spread below them, the river, the bridges, the lights of the South Shore laid out in long amber lines, and he stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at all of it without seeing any of it. "You couldn't have known," she said. He turned. "I should have had better protocols for that event." "You had good protocols. I noticed something wrong." She came to stand beside him, facing the same view. "You can't build a procedure around that." Victor was quiet. She knew this silence now, the one that wasn't coldness, the one that had nowhere to go. "I heard the alarm," he said, "and I thought—" He stopped, started again. "When Lev died, I was 20 minutes away. I have spent 7 years making sure I would never be 20 minutes away from anything again." He didn't look at her. "Tonight I was 20 seconds away and it still felt like too far." Darcy said nothing. She let the sentence settle between them without trying to fix the shape of it. "I know about Lev," she said eventually. "Marth told me." He looked at her then. "Not everything," she said. "Enough." A pause. "You've been carrying it like it's yours to balance." Like if you work hard enough and protect enough and provide for enough people, eventually the ledger closes. She held his gaze. It doesn't close. That's not how loss works. Victor's jaw tightened. You know that, she added quietly. You've known it for a while. The wind off the river was cold and continuous. Somewhere below, a delivery truck made a wide right turn, and its headlights swept across the building opposite. You're considering other positions, Victor said. The shift in subject was deliberate, but his voice gave something away. Darcy blinked. Where did you hear that? I employ people who hear things. That's a very mob boss answer. I could lie. Please don't. He looked back at the city. I'm not going to ask you to stay for the wrong reasons. What would the wrong reasons be? Because you owe me something. Because it would be convenient for me. Because you have no better option. A pause. Those are not reasons. They're conditions, and you'd feel them eventually. Darcy studied his profile. In the low light, he looked like a different kind of tired than usual. Not depleted, but honest, like something had been set down. I have debt, she said. I have a plan for it that doesn't include anyone else's money. I have a mother who calls every Sunday and gets the truncated version of my life, because the full version requires too many footnotes. She turned to face him more fully. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that staying or leaving is about what I'm building, not about what I'm running from. He looked at her directly. I know. Do you? You walked into a room with 3 men holding guns and opened a spreadsheet, he said. You are not running from anything. Almost a smile. Victor took one careful step closer. I want you to stay, he said. Not for the work. Not because it's useful. He paused. Because when you're not here, I notice. The building is the same. The numbers are the same. But something is different, and the difference is you. He held her gaze. I spent 7 years making sure I noticed nothing. I don't want to do that anymore. The city moved below them, indifferent and continuous. Darcy looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the conference room, about the coffee appearing on her desk, about Martha's hand and the rain against the kitchen window and the way grief, eventually, has to become something you carry instead of something that carries you. You laughed, she said. In that conference room, first time I saw you. Yes, because I walked in with a spreadsheet and you'd been looking for the thief for 8 months. That was part of it. What was the other part? Victor looked at her, really looked, in the way he sometimes did that made her feel precisely and entirely seen, with none of the elements edited out. You didn't look at me like something to be afraid of. You looked at me like an obstacle between you and a correct answer. Darcy considered that. You were, slightly. I know. I'm going to keep doing that. I assumed that was included. She was aware then that the space between them had become a question. She answered it by staying where she was and letting him close what remained of the distance. The kiss was brief and certain, and when they separated, Victor's expression had lost the quality it had carried for 7 years. The careful maintenance of someone who had decided not to want things. I love you, he said. The words came out as though he had been holding them for a while and had finally decided the weight wasn't worth keeping. Darcy looked at him steadily. I still have the student loans. I know. And the roommate situation. I know that too. And I'm going to argue with you in meetings. You already do. More, probably. Darcy. A pause. His voice was low and even, and underneath it was something that had been missing for a long time. I love you. She looked at him for one more moment, then, I love you too. Below them the city went on the way cities do, unaware and unhurried and entirely unbothered. Victor reached for her hand. She gave it. The following year, The Casale group's books were the cleanest they had ever been, which Darcy said was a low bar, and Victor said was an improvement worth acknowledging, and they argued about this pleasantly over coffee on 3 separate occasions, without resolving it. Marthe had taken to leaving pastries on Darcy's desk without explanation. Darcy had taken to leaving the financial summaries in plain language. Marthe could read without a glossary, which Marthe had never requested, and never acknowledged, and clearly appreciated. Gregor Bast had issued an apology that was awkward and insufficient, and Darcy had accepted it anyway, because people should be allowed to become better than their worst assumptions. He had, over several months, managed it. She had noticed that too. Victor still conducted his negotiations with a precision that made counterparts uncomfortable. His staff still adjusted when he walked in, but he stayed in rooms longer now. After the work was done, he asked after people's families and remembered the answers. He had, on one memorable occasion, remained in the building's common area for 40 minutes debating playoff hockey with 2 junior analysts, and had been, by Darcy's quiet reckoning, correct about every statistical point and gracious about none of them. He still carried Lev. He would always carry Lev. But carrying something was different from being buried beneath it, and the difference had not required him to forget, only to remember that the people still present were also worth being present for. Darcy cleared the largest portion of her loans by spring. She restructured the rest on her own terms. She declined Victor's offer to handle it entirely on 2 separate occasions, and when he purchased 14 pastries from the bakery she had recommended to a displaced colleague, she accused him of manipulating her goodwill with precision. He returned the following morning and bought 8 more. She eventually stopped objecting. On a Thursday evening in October, one of the junior accountants found Victor waiting at the entrance to the accounting suite. He was not there for a meeting. He looked for a man of his particular reputation, remarkably uncertain. The junior accountant went back to his desk and stared at his monitor with great intensity. Darcy came out 2 minutes later with her coat over her arm and stopped when she saw him. "You could have texted," she said. "I was in the building." "You're always in the building." Victor looked at her. Across the room, 3 junior accountants were at their desks, with the focused expressions of people absolutely not listening. "Come to dinner," he said. Darcy looked at him for a moment. Then she put on her coat. "You're buying," she said. "Obviously." They left together, and the building settled into the quiet particular to early evenings. Printers cooling, monitors dimming, the small sounds of ordinary life in a place that had become, without announcement, something it hadn't been in 7 years. Alive.